We are here today with Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in the UK. Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon.
He will be one of the special guests at the Open Innovation Days in Padova next 26th of October. And today we will talk about the sociology of fear, a theme that he has thoroughly explored during his career. In fact, in 1997, he wrote a book, The Culture of Fear, and now after more than 20 years, he returns on this topic with this new book, which is How Fear Works, from Bloomsbury. So in this book, Professor Furedi argues that fear appears to provide a provisional solution to moral uncertainty, and for that reason it is embraced by a variety of interests, parties, and individuals. And he also predicts that until society finds a more positive orientation towards uncertainty, the politicization of fear will flourish. So, Professor, in your book, you state that society has a modern obsession with fear. Can you explain what do you mean by it?
Well, I think what I've noticed is that every dimension of human experience these days often comes with a health warning. And we're kind of obsessed with seeing problems from the worst possible standpoints. It's always a worst case scenario that informs how we deal with an issue. And there tends to be an almost kind of powerful addiction towards being drawn towards a language of fear and anxiety in a way that is quite unusual. And one of the things I wanted to explore in the book is to try to understand why it is that we use fear and the language of fear so promiscuously. I argue in the book that it doesn't necessarily mean that we fear more than ever before, but we certainly talk about fear much more than in the past. And there's a kind of performative aspect to fearing where we demonstrate to the world that we're responsible, we're decent, good people, because we are prepared to fear this and that sort of issue or problem.
And of course, media play a huge role in promoting this culture of fear, let's say. Is there someone who is taking advantage of it in particular?
Well, I think that the interesting thing is that in many respects, you cannot say that one particular institution or one particular party originates the fear culture that we live under. I think this is something that is very much in the air. It's come about because of the cultural confusions and uncertainties of the Western world. But what is interesting is that the language of fear and claims about fear now transcend any particular institution or any particular political party. And one of the things that I find is that you can have very right-wing political movements like someone like Trump in the United States, talking about the need to protect society and the dangers that America faces and the need to build a wall between Mexico and America. And then you can have, in the same breath, people on the left more or less saying the same thing, but in a different language. So critics of Trump who say it's wrong to build a wall in the Mexican-American border are quite happy to want to build a wall inside universities around what they call safe spaces in order to protect university students from the pain and the hurt of the threat of language and words that they find offensive. And I think that's one of the interesting things is that you'll find that in Italy, for example, people talk about how the populist movements in Italy play the fear card and scare people about the dangers of migration. But at the same time, people who criticize the populists are quite happy to talk about the need to fear the populists because they're so dangerous. They're going to bring back the bad old days of the 1930s.
We also know, Professor, that fear is an almost universal emotional response in the animal kingdom. It is very useful as in terms of survival. Is there a distinction between, let's say, a useful positive fear and a negative damaging fear?
Well, I think as an emotion, fear is a fact of life, and there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing right about it. It's a response that we have towards the unknown, towards uncertainty. It's a response that's necessary to deal with threats. There's a difference between fear as an emotion and fear as a cultural accomplishment, in the way that fear is kind of turned into a language, what in sociology we call a cultural script of fear. And I think that has got to do less with the emotion, much more to do with the kind of instructions and ideas that we have about threats, about how much danger you and I are expected to deal with. The culture of fear is really about trying to provide a kind of alternative set of meaning to religion and various other ideologies that might have dealt with uncertainty in the past. So in that sense, I would say that the emotion of fear is perfectly all right. There's nothing really wrong with it. But it's when fear becomes a culturally dominant accomplishment, when it becomes politicized, that's when we run into trouble.
I would like to take one delicate example here, which is the fear of climate change. So the International Panel on Climate Change just released a few days ago its report, basically saying that if we do not succeed in keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees, it would be literally a disaster in terms of natural catastrophes, loss of biodiversity, forced migrations, and also human rights. In this case, is it all rhetorical fear, or is there something factual here we should be afraid of?
Well, I'm sure there must be something factual in the report. There always is. But I think the way that the facts are presented is one that invites the fear response. You see, facts can be interpreted in a variety of ways, and the response to threats can also be represented in ways that are potentially more future-oriented and more robust, or ones that invite us to be passive and to be the recipients of that fear. And I think this report is very one-sided. I think as all reports at the moment that look at the future tend to invariably use the language of survival. Everything is a problem of survival. Everything is an existential problem. Everything demands that unless we do something today, tomorrow will be the end of humanity. And when you look at the long list of things that people point to, in the book I talk about the fact that these days every single problem is projected into the future as a kind of ticking time bomb. It's a very commonly used metaphor in the English language, this ticking time bomb that we use very promiscuously. And I think this latest report tends to treat problems that I would describe as technical problems that require technical and scientific solutions, tends to kind of frame that as a problem of existence.
Regarding scientific solutions, I have a quotation taken from your book here. Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less. It was pronounced by Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie, and of course she was a great scientist. So, do you think, Professor, that we have instruments in order to understand more and fear less? What kind of instruments society has today?
Well, the most important instrument is knowledge, and I think one of the tragic developments recently is that to some extent we've lost a bit of faith in the capacity of knowledge to transform society for the better. So the authority of knowledge has declined precisely at a time when we're increasing our knowledge all the time. So there's even a growing tendency to see the development of knowledge as itself a danger. And a lot of people say, isn't it bad that that we kind of developing knowledge all the time? And the more we know, the more we become able to harm things or to create new problems for us. So, whereas in the past, human beings sort of were feeling uncomfortable by ignorance and wanted to overcome the state of ignorance so they could understand the world more. Today we're a little bit more estranged from knowledge itself, and I think that is why we tend to have such pessimistic cultural attitudes towards the problems that are thrown up, like global warming. And I think it's a question of changing the way we educate children, the way we educate people at universities. But overall, I think we need a more humanistic culture like we had in Italy in the Renaissance, which kind of combined knowledge with risk-taking, with experimentation, with trying out new things, instead of today where experimentation is in a very kind of conservative way regarded as potentially dangerous.
And going back to one of the points we started from, that is uncertainty. So the problem that people have with dealing with uncertainty. Also, we've seen this example of the IPCC report on climate change. Do you think it is a problem of communication, so that when we use fear in communications, we obtain certain results, and when we do not use fear, we can obtain other results?
I think there is a problem of communication in that very often we do tend to use a kind of a scaremongering language in order to pressurize people to kind of do as we want them to do. I think that's a very much a problem that you particularly find in the domains of public health and policy making. But I think there's a broader problem which underpins this, which is that in general, we've kind of tended to develop an attitude towards uncertainty that is extremely sort of unexperimentative, that is very, very confused, because we tend to regard uncertainty as just simply a threat, rather than regarding uncertainty as potentially interesting, maybe providing new insights if you kind of engage with it. There were times in history when people embraced uncertainty and regarded it as an opportunity to make things happen. I think those kind of robust sort of attitudes have become marginalized to some extent. And instead of seeing uncertainty as something that we want to engage with in a kind of activist way, we tend to regard it in a very kind of passive way, that uncertainty is something that happens to us, that we need to sort of to some extent manage, rather than to explore and deal with and eventually gain new insights through having a conversation with it.
Professor, thank you very much for your time and for this interesting conversation. See you in Padova, so in a few days.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.